Welcome to the ATHA online training on the management of humanitarian assistance. The module you are about to begin will introduce you to humanitarian action in the context of international assistance and interventions. This module will describe the key differences between humanitarian action and the separate but related areas of development, conflict prevention or resolution, peace building, and human rights. Some activities described as coming under these different headings may be similar, but it is important to understand the different principles, goals, and methods underlying each area, and the various frameworks in which they operate. We will also look at problems that can arise from failure to clearly differentiate humanitarian action from these other international interventions. This module will describe the conditions and situations of international agencies being involved in a country and help you understand the goals behind different forms of action. It will discuss links between these different areas, as well as potential clashes. You will hear from an expert on international interventions. At the end of the module, we will briefly revisit and expand upon key aspects of the information presented and provide you with references for further reading and study. In our engagement with practitioners, we often hear the following questions and concerns.
Is there a real difference between humanitarian and development work? There seems to be an overlap in activities.
I often hear from other actors that we are all working for the same goal. Is this true?
Does it really matter what label we give ourselves? We are all involved in helping people in crisis.
Humanitarian action is guided by IHL. Is there a similar framework for development or peacebuilding work?
We will try to provide you with some answers to these questions. Humanitarian agencies are often only one of a variety of international actors intervening in a conflict, post-conflict, or disaster setting. In a humanitarian setting, you may find development actors as well as actors focused on conflict prevention or resolution, peace building, human rights, and so on. When engaged in humanitarian work, it is important to understand the different roles of other actors, their triggers for intervening, and the goals that they are trying to achieve. Development actors are likely to have been present before the onset of the humanitarian crisis. Poverty, rather than conflict or disaster, is the trigger for development intervention. International development programs in general differ from humanitarian ones in taking a long-term approach to ameliorating the difficult conditions in a particular context. Development programs have sustainability as a central goal and focus on the growth of national and local capacity rather than the import, often urgently, of goods, services, and expertise from abroad. In 1986, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed the right to development as a universal human right, and international human rights agreements are relevant to the rights-based approach to development. But experts differ on the content of development as well as on how to achieve it. In practice, this means that development activities take a multiplicity of forms. The most important framework guiding contemporary development programs is that of the Millennium Development Goals, which have an overall aim of reducing poverty by 2015. Many development organizations include a humanitarian response capacity. Organizations such as Oxfam, Save the Children, and the IRC work on both development and humanitarian response. Humanitarian organizations have adopted some core development ideas, such as community participation, sustainability, and rights-based approaches to their programming. Conflict prevention, resolution, and peace building can be related to development, but have peace or avoidance of conflict as their central aim, rather than the reduction of poverty. Conflict prevention or resolution and peace-building activities will therefore be undertaken if conflict breaks out, or if early warning systems indicate that conflict or relapse into conflict is a risk in a particular context. The specific activities undertaken toward the goal depend on how the cause of conflict is analyzed, but they typically include support to institutions that safeguard democracy, the rule of law, and basic safety and security. They may also include economic development programs and humanitarian assistance. Theories of conflict and peacebuilding are multiple. Within the United Nations, a series of key documents have laid out a vision for peacebuilding activities, most recently the World Summit Outcome document of 2005 and the work of the United Nations Peacebuilding Commission. This topic is dealt with in more detail in the peacebuilding module. In conflict and post-conflict contexts, there is often an international human rights presence. This generally involves monitoring and reporting on the human rights situation, as well as building the capacity of national institutions for the protection and promotion of human rights through training and other activities. A human rights presence may be deployed as part of conflict prevention, conflict resolution, or peacebuilding activities. However, it has as a goal the promotion and protection of human rights per se, not only as a means to prevent conflict or build peace. Indeed, the aims of human rights promotion and peace efforts may clash, as may be seen in the debates over transitional justice. Opinions differ on whether accountability for past atrocities is crucial to or potentially destructive of post-conflict reconciliation. Human rights operations may have specific mandates in country, but are guided by the overarching framework of international human rights law. The advocacy activities of humanitarian organizations may resemble the reporting of human rights monitors in the field, in particular when they concern rights violations resulting in humanitarian need. Many humanitarian organizations nonetheless insist on the difference between human rights advocacy, which aims for the respect of human rights, and humanitarian advocacy, which has the more limited goal of saving lives and alleviating suffering in the short term. Related to both conflict prevention and protection of human rights is the concept of the responsibility to protect, or R2P. Developed as a concept by the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty in 2001, R2P seeks to reconcile state sovereignty and international intervention by declaring that sovereignty entails the state's responsibility to protect its own population. The concept has been adopted and further refined within the United Nations and is now commonly accepted to have the status of an emerging legal norm. Focusing on the protection of populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, R2P obliges the international community to support states to fulfill their responsibilities and in extreme cases to intervene to protect populations themselves. R2P can become relevant to humanitarian assistance where denial of humanitarian assistance amounts to or contributes to genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. In the case of Darfur, the International Criminal Court included denial of humanitarian assistance as part of the charge of genocide. In the case of Libya, the Security Council explicitly linked the responsibility to protect with access to humanitarian assistance. Amongst the experts, there exists a general agreement that better coordination between actors in a complex emergency or protracted crisis will generally yield more efficient outcomes. However, to what extent integration of operations should be condoned, let alone encouraged, is a topic of significant debate. In the following interview, you will hear from Claude Bruderlein, an expert on humanitarian law and policy at Harvard University. Professor Bruderlein will discuss the integration of UN missions as a formalized policy. He will provide a brief historical context of the push toward integration, as well as highlighting key challenges of such an approach and his analysis of the potential future of UN integration.
So my name is Claude Bruderlein. I'm the director of the program on humanitarian policy and conflict research here at Harvard University. And I've been working for more than 20 years in this field, particularly with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the United Nations, and other organizations, and now leading this successful program at Harvard.
Thank you. Based on your analysis, as you know, in 2000, the Brahimi report introduced this concept of integrated missions as the standard moving forward for all UN operations. Why is it that 12 years later, this still remains such a contentious debate?
Yes, indeed. The 1990s have shown that humanitarian operations and peacekeeping operations could become very complex in the field. We had the case of Rwanda, the case of Srebrenica, and in response to that increasing complexity and confusion at the level of the mandates and the field, Mr. Brahimi led a commission to come with a report about the importance of integrating all these components together around a clear strategy for peacemaking, how we can foster peace by integrating the various programmatic components of political, security, development, and of course humanitarian interventions. As this policy of integration took place during the first decade of the 2000s, we could see that the friction and somehow the competing agenda between these sectors become even more apparent in terms of methods of planning, in terms of policy regarding contacts with being governments or civil society or even armed groups. These various components have distinct perspectives in terms of who we should be engaged in terms of mediation, who we should be engaged in terms of negotiation, planning, who are we accountable to. In this context, as much as the policy of integration was quite effective in bringing more coherence in the use of resources, communication, transport, logistic, as well as representation of the UN system, it became also more problematic in terms of how respecting the integrity of the agenda and principles, and particularly the principles of humanitarian action, in light of competing agendas and principles in other sectors. For example, the most salient component is that the UN mission is mandated under the Security Council to fulfill very clear political objectives, and most of the time in support of the state, of the government, toward greater legitimization, democratization, a very clear political agenda, while the humanitarian response is predicated on neutrality, of not taking side into the hostilities, and therefore having the humanitarian mission being integrated into a larger political mission represents serious challenges for the operators to engage in such process.
Yes. So given these challenges, but also opportunities along that line, what do you see on the horizon for strategies and methods for humanitarian operators to mitigate some of the negative aspects, but to capitalize on some of the more advantageous aspects of integrated missions?
That's a very interesting question. I think there's three levels where there's a need for further efforts. The first one is at the political level. I think the humanitarian community will have to, do some soul searching to identify, in terms of values, what they consider to be their core, essential way to operate that has to be respected into a larger integrated mission. We spoke about neutrality, independence, impartiality, but these are currently keywords in the humanitarian doctrine. It's not clear even for the operator what they entail. What does it entail to be independent as a international NGOs funded by governments or even charitable organization? What does it entail to be neutral in a country where there are ethnic rivalries, where there is gender tension and a number of sources of violence that the presence of humanitarian organization and the relief program may even aggravate. And finally, they will have to see how to mediate these values and find ways to accommodate with other extremely valuable, and I think that's where the whole UN community recognized the interdependence over time between political development, security, and humanitarian response. And I think there is a growing will from all the components to find ways to accommodate these point of distinction. The second level is at the professional level. There is definitely a need to develop a consensus among professionals on how to operate in these circumstances. There has been a lot of discussion about the use of emblems, the use of white cars, how to present themselves when we are UNICEF, but part of the UN that has also UN peacekeeping forces or a UN mission. There's clearly the need for these professionals to come with some, again, common modus operandi on how to operate, because essentially issues of neutrality, impartiality, and independence are issues of perceptions. Case by case, we need to be able to analyze what are the tolerance for integration, what are the signals that should be sent to the parties and the population on the distinctiveness of these tracks, and how agencies themselves can guarantee the integrity of their program, that these are not being used for other goals and stated by the agency themselves. In other words, humanitarian programs are truly impartial and neutral and used primarily for providing life-saving assistance to the people in need. And ultimately, at the technical level, we need to do much more research on the actual risk entailed by integration. There's some doubts and very much a lack of clarity into what are the actual risk associated to integration, to what sense the proximity between peacekeeping forces or peace enforcement military forces and development, political and humanitarian actors has endangered UN operations. And therefore, to be able to measure the cost benefit, because actually it may have also facilitated their presence by allowing them to operate in a safer environment and therefore having more population benefiting from their services, without which this presence, these services would not have been made available. So currently, most of the discussion is at the identity level. It needs to be brought at a much more practical one, as we've seen in Congo and other locations. And also more research needs to take place to be able to better measure the actual risk involved in various geometry of integration.
Well, thank you so much for this excellent overview of the debate, but also your analysis on the key challenges and opportunities moving forward.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
In the first section, you learned about the key differences between these major forms of international intervention into situations of crisis. You heard an expert discuss some of the practical problems that can arise when practitioners from these different areas fail to properly understand the different goals underlying their work, and which illustrate the complementarities or contradictions in the different fields. We will now look more closely at why it matters to understand and articulate some of these differences. Humanitarian and development activities often take place alongside each other, sometimes within the same organization, but there can be problems reconciling the two modes of action. Development actors may criticize humanitarian programs for substituting their own goods and services for local ones and undermining years of work spent building up local capacity. They may also criticize the lack of priority given to sustainability by humanitarian actors. From a humanitarian perspective, it can be important to maintain a distance from some local institutions, especially when these are seen as parties to a conflict. A too close association with development projects and actors can threaten the neutral image of humanitarian actors and their access to the conflict-affected population. Conflict prevention, resolution, and peace-building programs may include humanitarian assistance, for example, where the strategy includes quick impact projects designed to avert conflict by making people feel a swift improvement in their situation. These may resemble humanitarian assistance programs where they involve direct provision of essential goods and services. However, humanitarian actors have voiced serious concerns about the incorporation of humanitarian assistance in this way. Conflict prevention, resolution, and peace-building have explicitly political goals, as they aim to change the way society operates. Humanitarian action, on the other hand, relies on its impartial nature and perceptions of its independence and neutrality to gain acceptance by parties on different sides of a conflict. Where humanitarian assistance is seen as part of a political effort, it loses its most important tool to access populations in need. Those opposing the peace-building effort may refuse access to humanitarians or even consider them party to the conflict, with serious implications for security. More fundamentally, when humanitarian assistance is used to help achieve peace, different beneficiaries may be selected when need is the only guide. Aid delivered on this basis cannot truly be called impartial, and impartiality is a key characteristic of humanitarian assistance under international law. Nonetheless, many humanitarian actors are keen to emphasize their humanitarian rather than their human rights character. Human rights, by definition, make claims on a state and hold it accountable for the way it treats its population. In its most narrow form, humanitarian action simply helps a state in assisting its own population. Unsurprisingly, states are generally more willing to allow humanitarian organizations to operate in their territory than human rights ones, who inevitably challenge the state's behavior. In practice, many humanitarian organizations also challenge the state on its obligations towards its population. Such activities are a legitimate part of humanitarian action where they seek to protect and assist populations in need. However, maintaining a humanitarian rather than human rights profile may be crucial to continuing operations in more authoritarian contexts. As humanitarian professionals, you are likely to be confronted with a range of different national and international actors in the field, each engaged in activities to address conflict, poverty, human rights, and humanitarian need. Organizations with different goals may run activities which appear quite similar. To understand how all these different programs fit together and how they relate to your own activities in the humanitarian sector, it is crucial to understand the underlying purpose and different frameworks regulating each one. For humanitarians, it may be particularly important to maintain a clear distinction between humanitarian action and other, more politically engaged sectors. The purpose of this module under the Basic ATHA online course is to introduce you to the conditions and goals of different forms of assistance interventions. In addition to the information provided here, you will find documentation and links in the associated resource section on the ATHA portal. We hope you found this basic introduction to humanitarian action in the context of international assistance and interventions useful, and we look forward to your comments and feedback.